Okay, so I will talk briefly, just for about 5 minutes, and then turn it over to Jen to talk about some strategies for how we frame this. Our first goal with frameworks and what brought us together in such a beautiful collaboration was to think about what it is we wanted to say about adolescent development. And we created with them what we call the core science of adolescent development. What are the key principles that we, as the developmental scientists who sat around the room thinking about this over 3 years and over more than 3 years, probably iterative process, what did we know from all the research our colleagues are doing in the field? What did we know that we wanted to summarize and distill and message about? Okay, slide, sorry. So first I'm going to tell you, oh, sorry, that's perfect. What what the core science of adolescence is. And the graphic that you see on the right summarizes a lot of research. And that's, I think, the challenge that we often find as scientists is that we know all the studies that our peers are doing, and we want to reference them and we want to include them when we talk to policymakers and practitioners. But the sound bites, or the small snippets of information, is what actually needs to be communicated in order to be effective. So we know that the 4 boxes that you see here represent a larger body of work, but I'll briefly describe each of these. So the first thing that we identified as part of the core science of adolescent development is that our adolescent years, and notice that I said our, could reference, I learned that from Nat, that we don't say they, that our adolescent years emerge around age 10 when puberty strikes, and they go through about the mid-20s, when we now know the brain continues to develop. And it's a period of remarkable growth and opportunity. It's change, but it's change in a particular way that lends itself to a lot of opportunity. That leads to and supports the next box on the right, the discovery that happens during adolescence, where we learn, discover, and adapt to the world around us. And we forge a sense of who we are and who we aspire to be. Now, this box represents research showing that the adolescent brain is flexible and plastic and adaptable. And all of those are really helpful in supporting the transition from adolescence into adulthood. This box also represents all of the research on identity formation and seeking out the activities that make us who we are. If you go down to the lower left box, we included as part of the core science that we learn to make decisions, we manage our emotions, and we create deeper connections with peers and others in our community. Again, this references a large body of work showing that the adolescent brain is primed for learning, that the changes that happen in the mesolimbic system are actually really adaptive and important for us to learn about our environment and to help us make decisions. That instead of thinking about adolescents are over emotional, as sometimes is described in the current narrative, we learn to manage our emotions because our emotions are important and helpful. But as the brain continues to develop, the brain supports our management of emotions. And finally, we want to underscore the importance of establishing deep connections with people. The motivation to establish connections with our communities is really important and a huge asset of adolescence. This is a time in life when people seek out making new social connections, and that should be honored and celebrated. And finally, we also include in the core science that we build resilience and develop interests, passions, and meaningful goals that shape our adult lives. And so here we wanted to signal that the activities that we participate in, the things that draw us in during adolescence, are not just for this period in life, but they also help set the stage for the next stage in life. So the work I briefly talked about here is built in these 4 boxes, but this took a lot of work, as I mentioned, and we identified the core principles of the science through a lot of different conversations. And through this process, we talked about what we wanted to say and what were the problems with how it was currently delivered in the field. Okay, next slide. So one thing that we really wanted to highlight is that adolescence is a time of remarkable opportunity, and I already mentioned that. But not just when we identify the period of adolescence. Often when I know my colleagues speak to policymakers or other stakeholders, they want to know who is an adolescent. And that's actually really challenging to define, because we know it's not just bound by a particular age range or a particular grade in school, but that it spans a transition period. And so when we give a definition of adolescence, we don't just want to give an age, but we want to acknowledge the diversity that occurs during adolescence in terms of developmental periods, but also what happens during this time. And in general, regardless if you're talking about a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old, it's a time characterized by rapid growth, development, and learning. Okay, next slide. We also wanted to make the point that the changes that occur in the brain during adolescence are well suited and actually well prepared to meet these developmental tasks that we mentioned before. That the brain plasticity that occurs during adolescence is helpful because it generates heightened sensitivity to environmental input. That means that the adolescents are constantly learning about the world around us. That adolescence serves an important function in refining and stabilizing connections in the brain through numerous processes, including myelination, which helps to enhance efficiency of different brain networks. And finally, we know that motivational systems in the brain are highly engaged. And previously, this heightened reward sensitivity or heightened engagement of regions that support risk-taking have been characterized as a negative attribute of adolescence. But in fact, we know that these changes in these motivational systems help to motivate the brain. They help to motivate adolescent behavior in really positive ways. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jen. So that was basically the core science that we generated and identified with frameworks, and then they really helped us think about how to talk about these core principles. Jen?
Thanks, Adriana. Just a quick reminder in this little switch between the two of us, if you hopped in late, please remember to fill out the poll about these interest areas. Andrew mentioned them at the beginning of the webinar, and I'm going to forget them off the top of my head, but I believe it's education, mental health, social media, and peer and family relationships, because we'll use that for the breakout rooms where you get to practice these framing strategies. So as Adriana mentioned, we worked for several years in an iterative process on identifying the core science, but once we had identified, once we had it, we still had to deliver it well. And so again, in partnership with frameworks, they identified several key strategies for talking about adolescent development. And many of us at the Center for the Developing Adolescent and on the National Scientific Council have been using these for several years. And I guess I just want to upfront say that some of the changes have been harder to make than others, but you definitely can teach old dogs new tricks. So what Adriana and I wanted to do in this section was select a few of these strategies that we had personally found to be really helpful and that we find we're using a lot when we speak about adolescence. Next slide, please. So the first one, and you've already heard this mentioned several times today, is to balance negative perceptions of adolescence by advancing a positive vision of young people and their development. And so the first little text box you see here is a sentence, with a message about adolescent development, kind of a before, and we'll, read this. It says, younger adolescents are vulnerable to peer pressure because they're still developing the skill to make their own decisions and develop resilience. Now with a reframe, and if you can click to the next slide, you'll see how this could be improved on by using the strategy of putting the positive first. So in this version, we see that younger adolescents are developing skills to make good decisions and build their resilience. That is a much more positive frame than the first version. And how do they do this? They need space for positive interactions with peers to fully develop these skills. So that's a good example of something we've been talking about already today, this what, but also some of the how. You're saying, how do they do this? How do they develop these positive skills? In this strategy, some of the other things to think about are, and this, I try to remind myself of this whenever I'm trying to use this strategy, is that you don't want to find yourself on the defense, right? What is it? No, it's usually the best offense, the good defense. But no, let's flip that. Let's reframe that and say, you want to reframe. So you're not constantly rebutting or kind of trying to defend against these negative perceptions. And the order really matters here. If you start with the negative and then rebut it, what they're remembering and what they've digested first is the negative scenarios, negative framing that you've presented. There are a number of other elements or ways you can do this so that are effective. Things like amplifying the stories that young people tell about themselves, and these stories about youth activism, youth engagement, how youth are part of their communities and engaged in them. Those are ways to get that positive message across. I want to admit, and this is something that we wrestle with on the council and at the center, that well, one, it's difficult to shift the narrative when it's so easy to start with these risks, these bad outcomes, and as scientists, in the way that our funding models are sometimes or are frequently aligned, that's what you start with. And so it is really a mindset change, but it's really, really valuable and worth it. On the other hand, we have talked a lot and wrestle with ourselves how to balance this. You're kind of threading a needle, because some of these issues, they are so important. There's the actual risks. If you overblow the positive, you kind of get to that point of appearing Pollyannish, and it can be hard to take the message seriously. Some groups will say, you just don't understand how serious this is. So it is really a tightrope you're walking here, that you want to maintain credibility, but lead with the positive and frame it positively. And in some areas, in some domains, that can be more difficult than others. Let's see, next slide. We're going to just pass back and forth. Adriana, you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so one thing that we found in working with frameworks is that using discovery metaphors to explain how adolescents benefit from opportunities to try things out and learn is really helpful, because that's actually what adolescents are doing. And in fact, anyone, all stages of development, we learn through discovery, we learn through trial and error. So framing that in a positive way is actually accurate. Adolescents do learn through discovery and exploration and trial and error, but ensuring that the words and the verbs that you use in conjunction with it are positive. So instead of thinking about or saying young people develop through opportunities for learning and new experiences. Okay, next slide. One way to frame that is to say, when young people have the opportunity to explore new terrains, they develop the skills they need to become contributing adults. So, the first one is correct, that they do develop through opportunities for learning and new experiences. But the second one frames it as saying, when we give them the opportunity to do this, they thrive. They go beyond what they may learn on their own, or with the opportunities available to them. And so being creative and expressing the metaphor in multiple ways is also helpful. So talking about how we can create opportunities for discovery-based learning is important. And this is, I think, actually quite effective when speaking to stakeholders in the education space or in other spaces where discovery and learning are inherently a part of the conversation. Using language that includes exploration and trial and error learning to talk about identity formation is also relevant. We may not often think about trial and error learning as associated with identity formation, but certainly it is. That during adolescence, we try on different hats, and that's completely okay. We're finding ourselves and finding out the identity that best suits our who we are. And explaining how resources and environments shape opportunities for discovery-based learning is really important. And finally, I think, and Jen, I think you mentioned this, that repetition is really powerful, that saying things in multiple ways and in multiple times and multiple spaces is really effective. We right. So one other thing we found is that talking about development as a process and a journey is really important. That adolescents and you know, some of the language I shared in the beginning that is sometimes finds its way to headlines is that adolescents are doomed, and that's a really deterministic way of talking about adolescence. And instead, talking about the process or journey that we're all on as adolescents is important. Okay. Next slide, Jen.
Okay, thanks, Adriana. So this is, I think this is actually one of my favorite frames, and I find myself using this all the time. So, and we saw, again, we saw some evidence of this, that when Nat was presenting these kind of randomized, oh, see, I did it too. This must be universal. Like I just, the randomization into this sort of community value versus vulnerability when thinking about early childhood mental health. And I find this kind of framing approach to think about the value of community and the connections and how adolescents are part of, they're part of the community. This here, let's go through these two examples. So an original sentence here would be, supporting adolescents can improve not only their personal well-being, but their academic and professional success. And you might think, hey, well, that's kind of good. We are talking about the positives. There's some good things here, right? But how can we improve it? So on the next slide, you can see on the after version is that supporting the adolescents leads to healthier and more connected communities. And there are lots of things you can think about this. One, you know, these items, these positive things that they can develop that are listed in the before frame, they're sort of individual focused, you know, their personal well-being, things that they're doing, and can kind of inadvertently lead to, again, this, you know, their personal well-being, them versus us. So you're getting kind of this othering happening through that type of frame. But also just that when you can help draw out the links between adolescents and how they're interconnected and a vital part of our communities. You also, in particular, provide spaces and ways to talk about marginalized, about historically and persistently underserved youth. And then as best as you can, when you have that information, when you have the information available, you would want to try and explain again, what are the hows of how adolescent development relates to community level outcomes that are important. And so I find that, again, a key element of this is talking about using the term we when we talk about adolescents. It's not they, it's not their personal interests, but that investing in adolescence is investing in the future of our communities. We're all in the community and we're in this together. And I think it's a really powerful frame that I find myself relying on a lot. Adriana, do you want to do the next one?
Yeah. Okay, so foregrounding the future effects of adolescent development is also important. So here we have another before and after. So the before is high school students who have strong relationships with their teachers are more likely to graduate from high school. Next slide. And then after, supporting strong relationships with teachers is one way to increase the high school graduation rate, which in turn builds a stronger workforce and a more robust economy. Will also resonate with a particular population of your audience. So knowing that adolescence, as I mentioned before, isn't just a static point in time, but is a part of a journey or a process is really important to remind people of. I think we all know that, having all been adolescents, but it is important to remember that this messaging should be repeated to those who may not be thinking about adolescence in this way. Okay, next slide. Oh, I think we were going to skip this one for now, right? We have these resources available.
Yeah, and I think just to wrap up what Adriana said, and I think hopefully what you've seen is that once you start down this framing journey, it's a process of discovery, right? You find the ways that they actually are intertwined. And so, you know, that recommendation, that last strategy that Adriana talked about, I just, you know, they all link together. It ties so well to community values. It ties to this positive frame is sort of the first strategy. And so some of those, some of those are individual level items on that sort of do and don't checklist. And as Andrew is mentioning in the chat, all of those materials are available on our websites, and we'll also share links to resources at the end of the workshop.